I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the battlefront, look at the Russian shelling in Kharkiv, and analyse the latest worrying news from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 18th of August, day 176. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Dominic Nicholls, our Russia correspondent, Nataliya Vasilyeva, and senior reporter, Daniel Capurro. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. A couple of things to note here. So shelling over the last couple of days in Kharkiv, that's just the Ukraine's second city to the northeast of the country. It's left 7 dead, 30 wounded. Hit a residential block last night, which accounted for, I think, 6 of the dead. No military advantage there, seemingly no point to it. Russia has been pushed out of Kharkiv a few months ago, actually, pushed out largely out of artillery range, not completely, as we've seen here, but have been able to effect no major breakthrough or threaten no major breakthrough there. Equally, Ukraine haven't been able to push past what crust is left of the Russian front line up there, so they've not been able to properly get at those supply lines coming down from Russia into the Donbass, but it's been a largely static front line. So Russia chucking shells around now serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. I mean, what is the point of this? If you're just using your military kit without any thought or without any greater plan, then you've got to ask what is the significance of it. So just hold that thought for a second. Also, there's been reports today of from Finland that 2 or 3 MiG-31 super fast interceptor aircraft, Russian MiG-31s, violated its airspace, Finnish airspace, and separately but probably connected, the Russian Ministry of Defence said that they had moved a couple of MiG-31s equipped with Kinshal hypersonic missiles to Kaliningrad. So, I mean, what's Russia trying to do here? I mean, they're moving some fighters around, very old fighters built in the early 80s. I mean, it's still very fast, but they go very fast in a very straight line. And they got some missiles. Yeah, great. Nice. Well done, fellas. Thanks for turning up. I mean, what do? They infringe a bit of Finnish airspace. I mean, Finland's not so stupid that they're going to immediately launch the interceptors and shoot them down. I mean, this is just playground stuff. So you match that with this senseless shelling and the killing in Kharkiv, and it says to me that they're doing all that they can. They can't push back in the south. They are, by the sounds of it, not moving forward in the south. It sounds like their command headquarters have had to move to the south of the Dnipro River. In the Donbass, they are a few meters advantage there, hundreds of meters each week. I mean, it's not what they should be doing. They should be doing much more than that. So Russia's not able to do anything. Alexei Arestovich, President Zelensky's advisor, says there is strategic deadlock at the moment. I think that's a fairly accurate description. And all that's happening here is that I think we're seeing a shaping phase from Ukraine for any potential counteroffensive in the south, and Russia have got no response. They cannot reply. So we see the senseless shelling in Kharkiv, the reports of moving some fighters around to Kaliningrad. I mean, great. It just does nothing. It's all they're able to do. They're not able to knit together any coherent plan. I don't think they've got any ideas. They've never had any fresh ideas. They're still grinding away in the very old Soviet-era doctrine of just pounding with artillery and then moving in later to stick a flag on the rubble. So they're not doing anything. They are not affecting any great military breakthrough or plan. They are just doing what they can, which is senseless shelling with no purpose to it, and moving some kit around, announcing they've moved some aircraft about. So, I think it's quite telling what we are seeing out of Russia and their actions in on the battlefield in the last 24 hours. I'll take a pause there.
Thanks, Tom. Just very quickly, you mentioned the hypersonic missiles. Could you just refresh our memories and refresh our audience's memories as well as what exactly these are and how worried should the West be about them?
So hypersonic, which is generally taken to be above Mach 5, which depending on the height it's operating at, but you're talking, I'm going to get my maths wrong here, please DM me and let me know, but I think you're looking at about 2,500 miles an hour. Anyway, Mach 5. All depends on the height for the air pressure and so on and so forth. I've got that completely wrong, so please educate me on that one. But a very, very fast missile. So the way to get through air defences, it's thought these days and in the near future will be firstly to go exceptionally fast, so you just simply can't intercept the missile, and secondly these hypersonic glide missiles they don't just follow a physical parabola. They don't just sort of go up in the air and then physics sort of determines where they land. So these things can come down very low and then can maneuver. So they can even if you do pick them up, it's very difficult to tell where they're going to go. And secondly, you're probably going to pick them up very late, because if you think about the curvature of the Earth, where you've got your long range sensors such as Fylingdales up in Yorkshire here in the UK, but these big radars looking out into space, because of the curvature of the Earth, you are not going to see missiles that are very low until they are very close to you, and hence you've got even less time to react. So instead of just firing ballistic missiles up in space and they come down with almost no guidance, a little bit of guidance, but not an awful lot. It's largely physics that determines where they're going to land. Hypersonic glide hypersonic missiles are designed to be very low, so you see them very late, and have the ability to maneuver. And then even if you do see them, they're going so fast that they just have the sheer kinetic energy to probably outrun any missile coming at it. And not only the warhead, but the sheer speed that it's going, the energy that would impart, just adds to the resultant blast when it gets to the target. So they are a very potent force. China have been developing them as well. I think the DF-12, I think that's the name of it, or DF-5. Anyway, DF something. China developing hypersonic missiles, as are the West, UK, and primarily the US. But it is an emerging area of military technology, one to look out for. It seems to be the way of things. Fighters are very good, but they're quite big and relatively slow. So it's thought that you want the fighter to stay well out of the way of engagement and just launch these missiles from afar, so they can travel vast distances at great speed. Or if you're going to get up close and personal with a fighter, you need great stealth technology like in the F-35, F-22, something like this, so you can operate with inside an enemy's MEZ missile engagement zone. So you're not seen. You have a very low radar cross section. So a radar operator would not see your aircraft there. You have either no radar cross section, or it comes across as a sort of flock of birds or something much smaller than it is in real life. Stealth or stay well away and use long range, very fast missiles seems to be the next sort of turn of the wheel in air and air defences.
Thanks very much, Tom. I think we all needed that, so that was incredibly comprehensive. Nataliya Vasilyeva, can I come to you? A top advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Ukraine should stop, quote, cancelling Russian people and instead try to peel them away from the regime. Can you tell us about this story? What did he mean by that?
Yes, I think it's quite a noteworthy comment from Alexei Arestovich, who is, of course, one of Zelensky's top advisors and who has quite an online following of his own, thanks to his daily briefings and often viral social media content. Now, his comments came after a couple of weeks of quite intense discussions within the EU and Ukraine about pushing ahead sanctions that would target ordinary Russians, as obviously Europe is running out of tools to influence Putin. And one of them would be to bar Russians from visiting EU, or, for example, bar Russians from acquiring tourist visas, which are essentially not just visas for tourists, but any short-term visit. Now, Alexei Arestovich published quite a lengthy statement yesterday morning. He didn't name any of his political opponents in Ukraine. He's just mentioned that a lot of his compatriots went overboard with criticizing and vilifying Russians, quite understandably after what we saw in Bucha and across eastern and central Ukraine and other parts under Russian occupation. The point that Arestovich made was that those calls to isolate Russians completely, to strip them of all visas, send them back to Russia, is not going to bring down Vladimir Putin's regime, but will basically push them into the embrace of the propaganda. And to Arestovich, Ukraine should actually be more strategic about using, as they put it, good Russians as a resource, as something that could bring about change, as something that could help Ukraine dealing with Russia years from now. Instead of that, he sounded quite frustrated with what we see as a common opinion about basically targeting the entire nation.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nataliya. Nataliya, you've also been looking at some of the economic implications of the sanctions on Russia. You wrote a really interesting piece about a Russian car factory in the West. Can you tell us about that? What's happening there for ordinary Russians in the West there?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I could speak to a couple of car factory workers and trade union activists last week. As you might know, the car industry is the single Russian industry that has been most affected by the Western sanctions, since almost every single car factory in Russia is foreign owned or has operated in some kind of partnership with foreign car makers. There's no domestic industry per se. They might be an actual factory in place, but all of the components, all of the expertise is outsourced, and that's a business that cannot exist in isolation, which is something that Vladimir Putin is now trying to do. And what we have seen since the war started was at least 10 foreign car-owned factories suspending their operations. One of them shut down permanently. The others have been suspended since. And as a result of that, we have tens of thousands of workers who have been furloughed, who are receiving some pay, typically 2/3 of what they generally make. But that's industry completely ground to a halt.
And what was what's the morale like of the people you speak to? How are they thinking of the war? I mean, I know in your article they were very careful about how they talked about it.
Yeah, people are increasingly cautious about how they talk about the war, even about the choice of words, because as we know, there's a law in place in Russia that criminalizes the very use of the word war. If you use the word, you might as well be facing time in prison. So there's this one manager at the Volkswagen factory that I spoke. He was very careful not to use the word. He's a quite young man. He's in his early 30s, and he basically spent most of his, or almost all of his professional life at this factory. And on an emotional level, he was very upset about what happened, but he's also he's quite clear about why this happened, and he doesn't blame his employer. He understands why it happens, but a lot of people like him are out of jobs, and their skills and qualifications are basically not needed. There are stories of people, getting depressed or sort of like bidding their time because they're still paid. One of the managers I spoke to, he was able to. He sort of decided that he has to do something new. He quickly found a small business to work with, and he's doing fine. But generally, he says people are obviously very upset because, as he put it, the life they had, it no longer exists, and it no longer will.
You've obviously been following events in Russia and people in Russia for the past few months. We're coming up now to 6 months of the invasion. How have you seen views change over that time? Is there anything that should give people elsewhere hope for the future, that there might be some challenge to Vladimir Putin's regime? I mean, how do you see ordinary Russians thinking of this?
Obviously, what we saw in the initial days and weeks of the war, there was this overwhelming, and I've written about it, there was this overwhelming feeling of shock, grief, disbelief at what happened, because a full-scale war with Ukraine was something completely unimaginable, and it took everyone in Russia, I guess, except for the 5 decision makers who actually made the decision completely by surprise. It took everyone by surprise. We saw a protest rally. We saw an initial outpouring of public rage and dissent, which was quite quickly quashed by draconian censorship laws, which have sent and are sending people to jail as we speak. So obviously there's very little protest on the ground. Every time I speak to somebody new in Russia, and I call people every day, every week, I see that people are being more and more cautious about being open about what they think about the war, even if we agree that I'm not using their last name. Obviously, there was an expectation when the war started that, yes, it is horrific and unimaginable, but everyone hoped that it would be over soon, and soon would mean days, weeks. I don't think anyone could quite see that it would take 6 months, and now, as you said, we're very close to 6 months. From what I can gather is there's a growing feeling of fatigue with the war, but also people are trying to get on with their lives. They're trying to get adjusted to the new economic realities as well, to the growing isolation. And also, I think it's important to say that this is still summertime in Russia. So sometimes when I speak to people or I go on Instagram and I see Instagram stories from Moscow about people partying and, drinking rosé at summer terraces, you get this, happy-go-lucky feeling. And a lot of people have just been enjoying their summer, trying to push the war from their minds as far as possible. Obviously, that's not going to, they're not going to be able to do it forever for various reasons, because the consensus opinion of experts and economists shows us that the most tangible effect of the Western sanctions, Russians are going to feel it starting September, October. Just not now. So I guess right now everyone is just going about their lives and not trying to think about what's going to happen very soon.
Thanks, Nataliya. Dom, I know you have a couple of questions.
Yeah, I do. Hi, Nataliya. Great to hear from you again. A couple of questions, please. Slightly disconnected, I think. Firstly, what reaction have you seen from Russia on social media channels or people you're speaking to about the recent events in Crimea? I just wonder how that's landed inside Russia. And separately, you're speaking to us from Istanbul. Just keen to hear the view there of President Erdogan's position and Turkey's position more broadly in the war so far, their pivotal role in the grain efforts to get the grain out, and I think they're going to be visited tomorrow by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So I mean, Turkey really is on the diplomatic front right in the middle of this. So I'd be very interested to see how that's viewed from inside Turkey.
Yeah, hi Dom, and thanks for these. On Crimea, definitely what we saw this weekend, and especially last week when we saw the first explosion in Crimea, there was an overwhelming feeling of shock, because despite the fact that Crimea is literally on the doorstep of a war, it has been a holiday destination. Friends of friends I know in Russia, they actually went on holiday in Crimea, which I found impossible to believe, but people have. Obviously, the explosions were taken with a lot of a shock. I've been recently going through social media to see what sort of holiday makers who are making reservations think. Are they trying to cancel all the bookings? And it's funny to see that, yes, they have been cancellation, and I'm speaking to people in the tourism industry, but the overwhelming sense of panic that we saw in those videos of people running away from the beach with the clouds of smoke towering over them, it's not quite representative. There's still a feeling that Russia has a strong army that can defend its own people. That it happened on one airfield. That's what I keep hearing. That this was just one accident. Okay, maybe another explosion happened. So here we have this unexplained fatalistic Russian attitude kick in. I know that people have been canceling holidays, and acquaintances of mine, the tourism industry, have reported, quite a bit of cancellations for the coming months. But it's not. I mean, it's not quite the situation that Ukrainians would like to see, that, everyone is going to evacuate the peninsula. I think it's also important to say that the explosions were Russia's hardliners on the war. They have taken those explosions quite painfully, and for a lot of them, it showed this gapping, it showed this stunning failure by the Russian Defense Ministry to defend what they think is Russian territory. Because in the past years, we have seen constant reports about defenses of Crimea being shored up, about S-300, S-400 missile defense system being brought in, creating the Russian version of the Israeli Iron Dome. But as we saw with those attacks, apparently they proved quite useless. So I think there's not quite. I mean, depending on what we saw on social media, it's not quite happening on a large scale yet. And to take on your second question about Turkey, you're absolutely right. President Erdogan has taken quite an active role in mediating between Russia and Putin. He is in a perfect position to do so, because he does have long-standing ties with Putin, and he has been able to find common ground with him, even in places like Syria, where Turkey and Russia have been backing opposing sides, essentially. They do have long-standing ties. On the other hand, Turkey never recognized the annexation of Crimea. Turkey has been very supportive of Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea. Erdogan personally intervened, I forgot the year, something like 3 or 4 years ago, to get local Crimean leaders out of prison, who somehow were pardoned and flown to Turkey. And the Kremlin never properly commented or explained how that happened, but Erdogan was able to use his way. But now we're in a position when Putin has been saying he doesn't want to talk. His stated goals for invasion keep changing every week. One day he calls Zelensky a legitimate leader, and he says that yes, we can talk to the Ukrainian government. But literally a week later, he talks about Zelensky as someone who seized power by force, and whose predecessors were elevated to power thanks to a coup. So it's going to be quite a tall order for Erdogan to try and get Putin to talk to Zelensky. Obviously, he already has some achievements to boast, including the grain deal, the deal to unseal Ukrainian grain exports from Ukrainian ports. So it's something to build on. I would say that his visit to Ukraine does sounds like something as an attempt to test waters and see what Zelensky might be feeling like. Erdogan hasn't visited Ukraine since the war started, unlike other world leaders, and he was recently in Sochi. So it's quite possible that this is all about testing waters at this point, not something concrete.
And just very briefly, because I know we need to move on, but just very briefly, your reading of President Erdogan, do you think he would be happy with the diplomatic win of getting the grain issue moving on, and he'll sort of push back from the table at that point and take the kudos? Or does he want more? Does he want to be seen as the peace broker here? Does he need that for his own standing? Or do you think he's already got enough of a win out of this so far that he's not going to take a massively active role from here on in?
I totally think that for someone like Erdogan, one win is not enough. The grain deal was heavily covered by state and sort of state-friendly media here in Turkey. I think it's important to say that Turkey is going through a very tough economic time, that Turkish inflation is highest in Europe, highest on the continent. I'm not sure, but definitely highest in Europe. I think the most recent figure is 90%. 90% year on year. So there's quite a lot of he's facing rights at home, and he's facing an election next year. So he would definitely want to. He would want a big prize. The grain deal was enough, but he would totally be up for a big price, I would say.
Thank you very much, Nataliya, and thank you, Dom, for those questions. Just one more from me before we move on. Earlier, Nataliya, you said that lots of Russians seem to be trying to ignore what's happening. They just sort of, they're partying in Moscow, they're hoping that it'll be over soon. In your view, do you think ordinary Russians have any sense of responsibility for what's happened, or do they try and push that away?
That's a really tough question, actually. That's an incredibly tough question, and we can talk about it for hours about the demographic and how split Russia is right now and how fragmented the society has been for years. I can just say that there's a small vocal majority there's a small vocal minority that has been outraged, that has been protested, that has found different ways to protest. Some people have expressed their dissatisfaction and disagreement with the government by simply leaving. I think a lot of those people do feel responsible in a way for what happened. But also those are overwhelmingly people who were in the streets in 2011, 2012. They were there in big numbers and they protested and they saw that nothing really happened. But what we can see right now is the majority of Russians, they would prefer to believe what they're being told on TV, because the truth obviously is too horrible to imagine that your country, that your army in your name is engaged in the atrocious crimes that we all know about. So I don't think we can talk about any responsibility among the majority of Russians at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Nataliya, for that. One of the big things we wanted to talk about today is events in the south at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We've got Dan Capurro here, our history correspondent, just to give us some context and just to talk a little bit about what happened the last time there was a nuclear meltdown in Europe. But first, can I just hear from Dom and Nataliya, what are the latest updates from Zaporizhzhia? What's been happening in the south?
Well, there's still reports, mainly from Russia, that Ukraine is shelling the area. Ukraine deny that. They say they would not be so reckless as to shell the nuclear power plant. I mean, we've also had Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, or the Ministry of Defense, Russia's Ministry of Defense spokesman, saying that they're expecting an egregious act in the next few days by Ukraine, which, we don't like this kind of language. This is, I personally don't believe it. And I think if there is something there, this is possibly lining up for a false flag. So this kind of rhetoric is not good. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is in town. President Zelensky in recent days has been pushing the idea of we need to have some resolution over the nuclear power plant. So it is coming to a bit of a head. I think Russia quite like that. They like sort of adding to this idea that it's all becoming a bit of a crisis because they can be the peacemakers here. Now, I mean, you would have heard Francis speaking in recent days about his fears. I'm just careful with my words here because I can see him lurking in the back of the pod. But he's very nervous that if and he's rightly so, I think, nervous that if Putin suddenly in his sort of magnanimous nature comes out and says, tell you what, let's have a ceasefire, because the war's not going well for him. He says, let's have a ceasefire. We need to bring order and calm to this situation, especially when there's nuclear power involved. As Francis says, there could well be a lot of external actors here amongst the international community who will grasp at that and who will say, yes, we need to do that. And that could be the thin end of a wedge, the wedge being a very poor peace settlement for Ukraine. So not surprisingly, I think Russia are trying to make as big a deal as they can out of the nuclear issue here at Zaporizhzhia. And I'm not saying there is no issue there at all, because there are military forces in the area. There are, I happen to believe, you might take a different view, but I happen to believe that Russia is firing from that area at Ukraine, so using it as some sort of, using the shield of the plant to know that Ukraine will not fire back. So it is a very serious issue. It does seem to be coming to a head, and there are some quite worrying comments coming out of the Kremlin.
I think one of the questions that lingers is like, why is Russia doing it? Why would anyone want to provoke a nuclear catastrophe, which will affect the whole Europe, the whole world, essentially? And this just brings us back to what I've been talking about in terms of the grain deal between Russia and Turkey, which is another classic. I think with the Zaporizhzhia power station, we have another classic example of Putin tactics, where he creates a crisis completely out of nowhere, that the crisis that shouldn't have been there in the first place. And then he is driving everyone into a state of frenzy and gets people to come to him and offer him a solution. And in the end, what we saw with the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, mediated by Turkey, in Russian state media, it was portrayed as a major victory of Russia. It was portrayed as something that Russia brought to the world. Russia has alleviated this food crisis. But essentially, there was not supposed to be any food crisis to start with, and I think we're facing quite a similar situation with the nuclear power plant now, because there was not supposed to be any nuclear crisis, and Putin is using just the same tactics here, I think.
Thank you very much, Dom. Thank you, Nataliya. Daniel, thank you so much for waiting. Can you give us some historical context and just talk to us a little bit about, well, this isn't a cheery subject at all, but why should we be so worried about what's happening in Zaporizhzhia?
Absolutely. No, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in that you have this sort of historical precedent, and obviously the fact that this war is happening in Ukraine, which is alongside Belarus, the country most scarred by a nuclear disaster, Chernobyl in 1986. But you've got two things going on, really. One, which is this sort of what's precedented and what we can look back at and say that we know might happen. But then you've got stuff that is totally unprecedented and that we really haven't seen before. So some of that context comes from beyond Ukraine. So looking at Chernobyl, there, without giving sort of a seminar on nuclear physics, basically you had a badly designed reactor built within the constraints of the Soviet industrial system. And, really some of it was fairly basic stuff, like not being able to do highly technical welding to create the right kind of containment chamber. So you didn't have a pressurized water reactor in Chernobyl, and it was an inherently sort of unstable design, an unsafe design that was never copied or used in the West. But the actual incident in 1986, there's some context that we'll touch on later because that relates to fighting around nuclear plants. But basically there was a decision to run a test at Chernobyl, which involved shutting down a lot of the safety systems because they had to force the reactor to be in an unsafe state to run this test. And the question they were trying to answer was, in that minute where the power is cut to the power station that provides cooling, that provides electricity for the pumps, for the water that cools the reactor, there's a delay of about a minute for the diesel generators to kick in and get those pumps going again. So in that minute, could the reactor sort of self-cool? Could the steam from the reactor power the turbines, power the pumps, and sort of cool itself? It was an incredibly reckless experiment. A lot of the scientists and engineers there were not qualified to do it. They didn't really have kind of the sophisticated sensors, the understanding of what was going on in the reactor. The chief engineer, Dyatlov, who many people will know from the Sky HBO program, ignored a lot of safety precautions. And basically, they pushed the reactor too far. The key factor was this: because of the design, steam bubbles basically increased the rate of reaction, whereas in Western designs they don't. And they pushed it too far, and then when they slammed on the emergency shutdown, it triggered a massive explosion, which blasted nuclear material, bits of the reactor everywhere, huge fallout. And then, of course, famously, there's the sort of the cover-up, the refusal to pass the information up the chain, the kind of the classic of this sort of the Soviet, the communist system of not upsetting your boss, not passing on the truth. The kind of the famous example of this is that the radiation meters that they used only went up to 3.5, which was the safe level, and so they said, "Oh, it's fine, it's only up to 3.5," when actually it was sort of 1,500. And the Soviet Union only admitted the problem after radiation was detected in Sweden. That story is sort of reasonably well known, and then you have this enormous effort of manpower to clear it up. But the key there is basically that you had poor engineering, poor communication, poor management, and an unsafe system that just went totally wrong. We can go into the political consequences in just a moment, I suppose, because they are really important for Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian history and self-identity. What's going on at Zaporizhzhia is very different. It's not this design of reactor that you had in Chernobyl. It's more like a Western system. It is a pressurized water reactor. It has, because it's smaller and more compact, it has a large, very thick concrete containment system around it, which the Chernobyl system did not. These concrete containment vessels are really substantial. They're designed to be able to resist being hit by a jet, basically, by a plane crashing into them. The New Scientist, I think a couple of days ago, had a report from an unnamed nuclear scientist in Ukraine saying, yes, our containment vessels are designed to withstand terrorists. But the key caveat he mentioned was that they're not designed to withstand attacks, by artillery, by rockets, by these kind of things. And this really is the big unknown, is that the Zaporizhzhia system is a relatively safe one. It has lots of safeguards in place. There were updates done to it after Fukushima to make it even safer. So it should, in normal circumstances, whether it's a tsunami or an earthquake, as unlikely as those are in Ukraine, not be a problem. But of course, people don't design nuclear reactors to be bombed and fired at. And here, really, we're talking about something unprecedented. So there's only really been 3 occasions where nuclear reactors have been bombed, mostly involving, pretty much all involving Israel. So you had Operation Scorched Sword in September of 1980, which was an Iranian mission, but probably with Israeli backing, as unlikely as that sounds in the current era, which bombed a Iraqi nuclear reactor that Saddam Hussein was building. But there were a few key caveats there. One was that the Iranians were worried about nuclear fallout, and so they deliberately only bombed the support buildings, support facilities, not the actual reactor, because they didn't know if it had been fueled yet. And then they later found out that it hadn't been fueled, so it wasn't filled up. About a year later, in 1981, the Israelis bombed the same facility again. This time they did actually bomb the reactor, but again it hadn't been fueled, and so the risk was relatively low. They were condemned hugely at the time, and Reagan, in his diary, we later found out, wrote that he genuinely feared Armageddon had arrived when the Israelis decided to launch this unilateral action. And in 2007 they did again Operation Outside the Box, which was this sort of small facility in Syria. It's still a little unclear what exactly it was, but it seems to have been a small reactor designed to generate plutonium, again for a bomb. And in that case, it was sort of not fully active, and again, not fully fueled, and hadn't been in operation for very long. So the risk there was relatively low. I mean, still pretty cavalier to turn up with a bunch of F-15s and F-16s and drop bunker busters on a nuclear reactor. But we've never really seen anything like that before. And that's where the comparison with Chernobyl really comes in, is that it's this explosion thing, right? So with Fukushima, there were worries about hydrogen explosions. There were a couple, but they weren't actually in the reactors themselves. And you still had a big dispersal of radioactive material. But what happens if you have a huge explosion at a nuclear power plant? Well, we know what happened at Chernobyl, but we don't know what happens when you fire sort of modern, or probably in the case of the Russian Air Force, not particularly modern missiles at a nuclear reactor. And that really, really is the unknown. Now, it may seem unlikely that anyone would actually do that, but there is a secondary risk, and this is one that we saw in March, which also applies to former nuclear power plants. So this was the worry in Chernobyl, is that even when they're shut down, they need cooling. They need electricity to pump water around the spent fuel, to keep it cool, to stop it reaching criticality and you having a very big problem. Now, at Chernobyl and in Zaporizhzhia and other plants, they have lots of backup systems. But the question is, if the electricity was cut, as it seemed to have been briefly in March in Chernobyl and possibly Zaporizhzhia, how long can those backup systems last for? How long will the power be cut for? And what happens when that power runs out? And that's the other kind of scary issue. That's what you had at Fukushima, which was that the diesel generators were all swamped by the tsunami and didn't run for several days, and you had this build-up of pressure, of steam, of hydrogen, of radiation. That's really the other major risk. If this power plant becomes effectively a battlefield, even if people do their best not to shoot at the actual reactor itself or even its cooling systems, what happens if the power's cut?
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that context and that history. Dom, can I just come to you quickly? From everything that Dan said, obviously you're formerly in the military. How does this make you feel? Do you think that the Russian military have a sense of the danger they're putting the entirety of Europe in?
I mean, I was speaking so we had Hamish de Burton-Gordon on last week, didn't we? Hamish de Burton-Gordon, when he was in the British Army, he commanded the joint NBC regiment, or CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear regiment in the British military, and he's gone on since to forge a career as a world expert in this area, which is why we had him on. And I chatted to him last week. I also spoke to a chap who was his 2IC, his second in command over that time, and Jim, the guy I was speaking to, he was very clear. He said that in our doctrine, in Western doctrine, CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear tactics and thinking is all about defensive. How do you operate in that area rather than how do you use it as an offensive capability in its own right? And he said Russian doctrine, Soviet doctrine before that was very much the other way round. It was looking at how you can use it as an offensive capability as well as defensive, as well as operating within that kind of environment, that dirty environment. So they are very well versed in thinking, not doing necessarily, but in thinking, which is half the battle, in thinking about how to use this in an offensive capability, not just in literally as a weapon, either nuclear weapon, chemical weapon, etc., or in radiological terms here to engineer an accident and have a plume that would, as Dan says, go across Europe and cause absolute catastrophe like Chernobyl, but also how to think about how far you push the diplomacy. And Jim was saying that they would have wargamed this. They would have thought about this. They would have looked at our responses to their comments whenever they raised the spectre of nuclear weapons. So they would have taken that on board and then planned and thought and wargamed diplomatic manoeuvres to see how close they can get to either having their bluff called or an accident, a miscalculation by somebody, which then spirals out of control. But how to push it just far enough to get what they want before they row back. And as we said earlier on today, we said that just as with the grain, as Nataliya said, just as with the grain, we see this engineered catastrophe, this engineered problem to which Putin can come riding to the rescue and say, well, I can sort this all out. I mean, as Nataliya said, it's a problem all of his own making. So, yes, they would have wargamed this. They would have thought about how far they can press it in terms of the military. So, literally, how many people can they sight there? How often can they get away with firing from those positions before the world does something about it? As well as drumbeating the rhetoric about nuclear Armageddon and, we think there's going to be an attack by Ukraine and so on and so forth. So all these things, they're not happening by accident. Arguably, they would have given more thought to this because of the consequences than they have to any of the tactics we've seen in the Donbass, a sort of armoured assault. So this is not happening by accident. The trouble is that we're playing for such high stakes. I mean, a miscalculation here on either side can have tremendous, as in the size of it, tremendously bad consequences. So, yes, they've thought about it probably a lot more than we have in an offensive way, but that doesn't mean that they are ninja strategic thinkers when it comes to nuclear diplomacy. We've seen them make all sorts of mistakes on the battlefield so far. I mean, number one strategic mistake was invading in the first place. So, I mean, they are not against making some absolute howlers, and there's nothing to say that they're not about to do the same here.
I've got two questions. I'm aware we're starting to run out of time, so just two questions for you all. One is, do we think that the world should be most worried about an accident or a miscalculation? And also, Dan, would you give us a sense of, we've talked about the consequences and we've talked about how awful this could be. Could you just talk us through what actually might happen, just so we're very clear on what the impact would be?
Sure. So if we go to that one first, I think if it came to some kind of direct strike on the reactor, really we're in uncharted waters. No one knows what happens because ultimately these are very, very sophisticated pieces of engineering with lots and lots of fail-safes. But if you drive a missile through one of them, artillery shells through all the key components, it's not particularly clear how they respond. Now, the big fear, obviously, is a complete and total meltdown in which the reactor goes critical. Now, we're not talking what happens in an atomic bomb. It's not what happens if a nuclear power plant, even when it explodes. Chernobyl did explode, and it was not like the explosion at Hiroshima, but you would just have huge amounts of radiation pouring out into the surrounding countryside, the surrounding countries, devastation of agriculture. All the kind of animals would have to be culled, livestock. You wouldn't be able to consume any of the dairy, fruit and veg, potentially fish. If you're talking about, you could be talking about this. Zaporizhzhia is on the Dnieper River, so all of this radioactive water flooding into the Black Sea, potentially into the Mediterranean. So you're talking about very, very high levels of radiation spreading everywhere and sort of devastating the vast swathes, basically, of the Near East and Europe. The alternative scenario, the one where the power gets cut, well, as I was saying, these are well-engineered systems. They have lots of backups. In that kind of situation, you have this slightly scary, as we did in Fukushima and to an extent 3 Mile Island, this slightly scary, how much time do we have? Can we get in and fix it? Can we restore the power? Will the Russians let nuclear engineers in? Are they going to insist on their own engineers? All this kind of horrible, quite scary standoff. The end result is the same, basically, that the reactor overheats, that you potentially have build-up, for example, of hydrogen that explodes, or some kind of meltdown of the reactor, intense build-up of gases, and again, an explosion that then releases huge amounts of radiation. So similar situation, but the build-up obviously very, very different when it comes to diplomacy and negotiations.
Thanks, Dan. I guess my initial question of what should we be more worried about, a miscalculation or an accident? Dom and Nataliya, would you want to take that? And then I think we probably I'll have to ask you for your final thoughts.
For me, miscalculation. I don't think there'll be an accident. I don't think Ukraine is daft enough to fire at it, which the Russians are banking on. I also don't think the Russians are daft enough to fire directly at the buildings themselves. However, miscalculation, it will always, I always veer on the side of cock up, not conspiracy. I'm very worried that the things could get out of hand, and it might be, as Dan says, it might not be the plant itself, but somehow the electrical power to the plant that is hit through miscalculation. That'd be my big concern.
I think in terms of, I echo what Dom says. I mean, there's a lot of brinkmanship here going on, right? And as Dom says, I don't see a world in which the Ukrainians would choose to fire at the nuclear power plant. And it may well be that the battlefront moves regardless of Zaporizhzhia, and that those Russian forces end up finding themselves stuck behind enemy lines and have to surrender or retreat. But I think, yes, the issue is one of miscalculation and one of the Russians engaging in brinkmanship and getting that very wrong. I think it would take a real madman to actually attack the plant or, commit some kind of false flag attack.
Well, thank you, Dom Nichols, Dan Capurro and Nataliya Vasilyeva. We didn't mean to scaremonger too much. I hope we haven't. It's just that this seems like such an important issue. I wanted to ask some of the really basic questions about, what actually happens, what's the history here. I thought that would be important for our listeners and for the podcast. So I hope you don't think we've been scaremongering, but we wanted to sort of play through and think about some of the impact of what doing what Russia is doing around this nuclear plant actually has. We've come to the end of our time today, so Dom, Daniel and Nataliya, can I just ask for your final thoughts? What should our listeners be thinking of in the next day and next few days?
Sure, if I might wrap up on the nuclear question. It does look like this is the time when Putin would be interested in some sort of a solution along the lines of the grain deal that we saw. If you look at the map of the hostilities in Ukraine, the front line has been essentially static for the past 2 or 3 weeks. So obviously for Putin and the Kremlin domestically, there's not really much to show to Russian public. There are no achievements to produce. So, say that he makes a deal with the International Atomic Energy Agency, mediated by Erdogan and something like that. And, they would package it nicely and present to Russians saying, yes, well, you see, there was this massive crisis that we averted. Russia saved Ukraine and the whole world from a nuclear disaster. So that definitely because the front line is static, I think it's totally in Putin's interest to come up with something like this right now.
For me, it's still on the nuclear issue. The front line is static. However, there's a lot of movement here in this war diplomatically. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of weapons flowing in. So let's have a look at Putin, what he wants. He likes engineering these crises and he likes being the guy to fix them. Grain, I don't know what he got for that. Maybe it was the international pressure that made him bow on that. I'm not entirely sure. But this is now arguably much higher stakes. The UN Secretary General is in town. Well, he's in Lviv today. So he's there looking not only at grain and at the wider war, but he is specifically looking at the nuclear question. So then we might find that there is a small deal over the nuclear plant, and UN inspectors go in, and it's a demilitarized zone. What would be Putin's price for that? I just wonder if in the background right now conversations are going on about with America primarily to stop those weapon supplies. If Russia are saying to America, we will hand over the nuclear power plant to a UN-sponsored force to look after it, demilitarize it, but you stop sending the HIMARS in, I just wonder if that conversation is happening right now. It'd be interesting to see when the next meeting in the Ramstein process, as in military aid to Ukraine, takes place. Ramstein Light, if you like, the British Defence Secretary led effort for military aid training and cash. I was in Denmark last week, remember? The next one of those is due in mid to late September, which isn't that far away, so we should start hearing noises about that. If those are delayed, then I will start to get very, very suspicious, and I will start asking questions about, well, I'll ask them anyway. Is Russia in the background trying to do a deal over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to get the weapon supplies stopped from the West? Because that, for me, right now, is the thing that Russia is most scared of.
I'll be very brief then, David, just on my final thoughts. Just to go back to what you were saying about scaremongering. I mean, yes, I think, the worst case scenario is a really terrifying one. But I think there's 2 key points to make here. One, the comparison between Zaporizhzhia and Chernobyl is important. This is a much more sophisticated reactor design with far more safety features and backups and passive cooling. And we've actually seen the resilience of modern nuclear power plants here, the fact that they've actually been able to withstand skirmishes and battles on their property, and there hasn't been a disaster yet. So they are more resilient than perhaps people fear. It's not totally a fragile situation. And then the other thing, of course, is that Chernobyl really was so disastrous, it precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union in a lot of ways and Ukrainian independence. And Putin claims to be a student of history, and I really don't think that he would look at that history of Chernobyl and think, yes, that's something I want to have happen.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.